Hey everyone, welcome back to Be Like Christ for another 5-minute Bible study. We're in a new location today and a new chapter, Exodus chapter 21. If you want the free handout and the free PDF that you can download, check out the link down in the description below. So let's jump into this. When did the events of Exodus chapter 21 happen? Well, God delivered the Israelites from slavery, which we talked about at the beginning of this book, in approximately 1491 BC. The events of Exodus chapter 21 took place about 3 months after the Hebrew people left Egypt. In terms of our characters, we really only have two. The first one is God. God descended on Mount Sinai in Exodus chapter 19. He's been talking to Moses, and here in Exodus 21, he's going to be giving Moses some of the laws that the children of Israel are supposed to live by. Then we have Moses, of course. He's having this conversation with God, or at least hearing God out and writing down his commands so that he can later deliver them to the Israelites. He's God's designated leader of the children of Israel as they're on their way to the promised land of Canaan. Our geography for this chapter is pretty simple. This was a conversation between God and Moses, and it took place on Mount Sinai, which you'll see on the map. So the first 11 verses deal with the rights of slaves and of slave owners. So Hebrew slaves were supposed to serve their masters for 6 years, and then they were supposed to be given their freedom. If a slave loved his master, though, and he wanted to continue working for him after the 6 years were up, the master was supposed to pierce the slave's ear at the door of his house, and the slave would remain in the master's service for the rest of his life. If you've ever heard the hymn, "Pierce My Ear," that hymn actually comes from this law in the Old Testament. So, fun fact. If an Israelite man bought a female slave, seemingly with the intention of marrying her, and for some reason she displeased him, he was allowed to let her be redeemed by another Israelite man, but he was not to sell her to a foreigner. If he bought the slave girl for his son, then he was supposed to treat her well. He was supposed to treat her like a daughter. And if a man married a slave girl and then he married another wife, he was not to treat his first wife, or the slave girl, poorly just because he had married another. She was still due all of the rights of a wife and all the benefits that came along with it. If the Hebrew man refused to keep these conditions, then he had to set the woman free. So then in verses 12 through 32, we have some laws that pertain to violence and abuse. So these verses contain God's laws for how the Hebrews were supposed to deal with violent crimes, accidental harm that was done to another person, or violence done even to animals or by animals. God laid out the judicial consequences for those who murdered, those who accidentally killed somebody, those who struck or cursed their parents, masters who hit their slaves, men who injured one another in a fight, men who struck pregnant women, and animal owners whose animals harmed somebody else. And you can read those details if you dig into verses 12 through 32. This is really just a summary of kind of the highlights. In some cases, the punishment varied depending on the extent of the injury that was done to the victim. And then finally in verses 33 through 36, we have laws regarding restitution for animals. So if a man dug a pit and he didn't cover the pit, and an animal came along and fell in the pit and died, the guy who dug the pit was responsible for paying restitution to the owner. If one man's ox killed another man's ox, the live ox was supposed to be sold and the money divided between the two men. But if the ox, the murderous ox, was accustomed to goring other oxen already, the man who owned the violent ox was required to pay the full price for the other man's ox, and he didn't get anything. So now let's finish off with an application. This chapter actually shows us that God values life inside the womb as much as he values life outside of the womb. We get this from verses 22 through 23 of this chapter. So verses 22 and 23 prescribe the punishment for a man who hit a pregnant woman and caused her to give birth prematurely. It tells us that if the child was born without harm, the violator was only supposed to pay a fine. But if the child died, the violator was killed, life for life. So notice that if a man caused a premature baby to die, his punishment was the same as if he had murdered a person, walking around on the street somewhere. So what we understand from this is that there's no question that destroying life inside the womb is against the will of God.